All right, so how do you tell a true visionary from someone who's, well, just a con artist?
It's a question for the ages, isn't it?
It really is. It feels more relevant than ever these days, though. With all these larger-than-life figures popping up, it's harder than ever to tell who's authentic, who's really trying to change the world.
Absolutely. And who's just looking out for number one?
Exactly. That's what makes this deep dive so fascinating.
Yeah.
You sent over some material on Elliot Rodger and Alec Manassian,
Yes.
two men who tragically committed these horrific acts of violence driven by, well, really disturbing ideologies.
Yeah, these cases really force us to look at the dark side of influence. What happens when rage and resentment, unchecked, find a platform in our digital age? It's a scary thought.
No doubt about it. Heavy stuff. But I think by digging into their backgrounds, the online spaces they were part of, we might start to see what led them down such a dark path.
I think so, too.
Maybe even spot some red flags, some patterns that, could help us prevent similar tragedy from happening again.
I agree. Looking at these cases from different angles is so important. Take Elliot Rodger, for example. His case, back in 2014, is a chilling reminder of how these online platforms can spread hate.
Right. His attack in Isla Vista, California, 6 people dead, 14 injured, and then he took his own life. It's the level of planning that's so disturbing. He left behind this manifesto, over 130 pages, and these videos, all detailing his hatred of women and, meticulously outlining his plan.
It's like he was creating this narrative to justify it all.
Exactly.
He paints himself as a victim, wronged by society, entitled to lash out. And tragically, that narrative resonates with a very specific group online, particularly in those communities we call the manosphere.
Okay, so tell me more about this manosphere. What is it exactly, and what role did it play in Rodger's radicalization?
Well, the manosphere is this loose collection of online communities, forums, the common thread, deep resentment towards women, a belief in very traditional gender roles, where men are dominant.
Ah, I see.
They push misogynistic views, this sense of male entitlement, and a really warped view of relationships. It's a space for people who feel alienated, powerless in their everyday lives, to find a sense of belonging, even validation, unfortunately.
It's unsettling to think about these echo chambers where toxic ideas can fester and grow.
Mhm.
And in Rodger's case, it seems like his involvement in these communities just amplified his anger and resentment. All those videos he posted expressing loneliness, blaming women for his lack of romantic success.
Right.
It's heartbreaking.
It really is. And it's not an isolated case. Alec Manassian remembered the van attack in Toronto in 2018.
Right.
He actually praised Rodger online before his attack, killed 10 people, injured 15. He identified with the Incel movement, which is an even more extreme part of the manosphere.
I've heard the term incel, but to be honest, I'm not totally clear on what it means. Can you break that down a little?
Sure. Incel is short for involuntary celibate. It's the subculture of men who believe they can't find romantic partners because of forces beyond their control. And often they blame women for their perceived failures.
Wow.
Their online spaces are filled with hate speech towards women, often expressing violent fantasies, a real sense of despair.
That's chilling. It's a reminder of how these online communities can spread dangerous ideas,
Yeah.
even incite real-world violence.
Yeah, and these cases highlight a critical point. We need to be aware of the potential for radicalization online.
Absolutely. So we've talked about their actions, their online activities, but what about their backgrounds? Did anything in their early lives hint at the path they would eventually take?
Let's look at Elliot Rodger first. He grew up pretty affluent. His father was a filmmaker. Seems like he had a lot of opportunities. Yet, despite this, he struggled socially from a young age. He was diagnosed with a pervasive developmental disorder and always seemed to be battling feelings of isolation and frustration.
So even with what seemed like a privileged upbringing, he still felt this deep sense of alienation. It suggests those feelings, that isolation and inadequacy, can cut across socioeconomic lines.
That's right.
What about Manassian? Did he have a similar experience?
Well, Manassian's upbringing appears more typical. He was from a middle-class suburb of Toronto, but there are reports he struggled socially too. Described as quiet, withdrawn, had trouble connecting with others. And he displayed some unusual behaviors, like a real fixation on cleanliness and order.
Those details, seemingly small on their own, they start to build a picture of someone who may have been struggling to fit in. Raises a big question about the role of mental health in these cases, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely something we need to dig into further. In Rodger's case, his family really tried to get him help for his mental health, but he resisted taking medication.
And with Manassian, We don't have public details about his mental health history.
That's right.
It's a reminder of how complex mental health is, how hard it can be to seek help, and the stigma surrounding it.
Absolutely. And it's so important to stress. Mental illness doesn't directly cause violence. The vast majority of people with mental health challenges, they don't harm others.
Right, of course.
But it can be a factor, especially when combined with other risks, like exposure to extremist ideologies.
It makes you wonder if there were any warning signs early on. Missed opportunities for intervention. What do you think?
Hard to say for sure, but maybe by tracing their lives, both online and off, we can better understand what led them down those paths.
That makes sense. And what really strikes me is how fixated both Rodger and Manassian were on the idea of finding a girlfriend. Like, they believed a relationship would solve all their problems and validate them as men.
Yes. That fixation on romantic success, seeing it as the measure of worth, is a huge theme within the manosphere.
Interesting.
They view women as objects to be acquired, a means to an end, not individuals with their own agency and desires. And that skewed view of relationships can lead to entitlement, resentment, when those expectations aren't met. It's so sad. Instead of seeking healthy connections, they got stuck in this cycle of anger and blame, searching for validation in all the wrong places.
Exactly. And that search for validation, combined with exposure to the manosphere's toxic ideologies, led them down a very dangerous path.
A path that ended in tragedy. It's a lot to process. What stands out to you the most so far? What's resonating as we unpack these cases?
I think it's the intersection of mental health, online radicalization, and this warped sense of masculinity. This whole web of factors that contributed to their violence. And while it's easy to focus on their individual failings, we need to look at the bigger societal forces at play, too.
I agree. Understanding the individuals, their ideologies, and the environment that allowed those ideologies to take root. It's a lot to unpack, but it's a conversation we need to have.
Definitely. And I think it's important for our listeners to be part of it. What are your thoughts? What's resonating with you so far? What questions are popping up for you? Yeah, we want to hear from you. Let's take a moment to reflect on what we've covered so far. What are your initial reactions? What stands out to you the most?
It's fascinating how these cases, as horrific as they are, give us this lens to examine the darker parts of online culture. Like we were discussing the role of mental health.
Right.
It's a critical piece.
For sure.
But it's so important to remember mental illness alone doesn't equal violence.
Right.
It's this complex mix of factors.
Right. And you mentioned earlier how Alec Manassian's case mirrored Elliot Rodger's in this really chilling way.
Yeah.
His van attack in Toronto, 10 people dead, 15 injured.
Right.
And just like Rodger, he left this digital trail,
Yes.
revealing his motives, praising Rodger, declaring the start of the Incel rebellion on Facebook right before the attack.
Exactly. Manassian's case shows the very real potential for these copycat attacks, especially online, where these extreme views are shared and almost encouraged.
Yeah.
His use of the term incel really highlights how insidious these online echo chambers can be. People find this distorted sense of belonging, of purpose in these spaces.
It's easy to dismiss these online communities as fringe groups
Right.
with no real-world impact. But
Yeah.
Manassian's actions prove that's just not true.
Yeah.
Their ideology clearly resonated with him, influenced his decision to commit this horrific act.
Sadly, yes.
We can't ignore the potential for online rhetoric to turn into real-world violence.
Absolutely. And it's important to say again, not all incels endorse or engage in violence, but these online spaces can normalize misogynistic beliefs.
Right.
It creates this breeding ground for resentment and hatred with these really devastating consequences.
So we talked about their online activities, the influence of the manosphere.
Yeah.
But I'm curious about their individual backgrounds.
Okay.
We touched on Elliot Rodger's upbringing, but what about Alec Manassian? Did anything in his past hint at his future actions?
Well, Manassian grew up in what seems like a pretty average middle-class suburb of Toronto.
Okay.
On the surface, his childhood seems unremarkable. However, there are reports that he struggled to connect with others. He was often described as quiet, withdrawn, even displaying some unusual behaviors.
Really?
Some classmates remember him being really fixated on cleanliness and order, and he had this habit of making strange noises and movements.
Those details, while seemingly small on their own,
Right.
start to paint a picture of someone struggling socially or maybe experiencing some underlying mental health challenges.
Possibly.
I know we can't speculate on a diagnosis, but it's hard not to wonder if there were missed chances to intervene.
It's a fair question.
What do you think?
It's crucial to remember everyone's path is unique and there's no one way to predict or prevent violence.
Yeah.
But these details highlight how important early intervention is,
Right.
and offering support to people who show signs of social isolation, difficulty connecting with others, or these unusual behaviors.
Absolutely. And it makes you think about the bigger societal picture.
Yeah.
The stigma around mental health, the difficulty of accessing care. It's something we need to talk about more openly and honestly.
I couldn't agree more. And beyond just individuals, we have to consider how online platforms make it easy for these dangerous ideologies to spread.
Right.
What responsibility do social media companies have to monitor and moderate content that promotes violence and hatred?
It's a tough question, isn't it?
It is.
It's this complex issue with no easy answers.
Exactly.
We want to protect free speech, avoid censorship,
Right.
but we also need to acknowledge the potential harm these communities can cause.
It's finding that balance.
Yeah.
One approach might be to focus on media literacy, critical thinking skills,
Okay.
giving people the tools to recognize and reject hate speech online.
Equipping people to navigate this digital world safely and responsibly.
Exactly. And maybe it's also about fostering a culture of empathy and compassion, online and offline.
I like that.
Yes, we have to find ways to counter that dehumanizing rhetoric that fills these online spaces.
Right.
It's about remembering behind every screen name is a human being
Yeah.
with their own complexities and vulnerabilities.
And maybe it's about challenging those societal norms
Yeah,
that contribute to this culture of resentment and entitlement.
absolutely. You're right, we need to address the root causes, not just the symptoms.
It feels like we're just scratching the surface of something really deep and complicated here.
We are.
What are your thoughts, listeners? What's resonating with you the most? It's been heavy, this conversation, hasn't it? But important, I think, to really face these dark parts of online culture and what they can lead to. We've been looking at Elliot Rodger and Alec Manassian, trying to understand what drove them to such violence. And it seems like we found this knot of influences, from mental health struggles to those toxic echo chambers of the manosphere.
You summed it up perfectly. It's a multi-layered issue, and it's easy to feel overwhelmed. Like, where do you even begin? But even when things feel dark, I think it's crucial to remember there's always hope. And even more importantly, there are things we can do to actually make a difference.
I love that. So let's shift gears a bit. Talk solutions. What can we do as individuals, as a society, to push back against online extremism, to prevent more tragedies like these? What are some concrete steps?
Well, one of the most powerful things we have is early intervention.
Okay.
We need to be alert, recognize those warning signs of radicalization in ourselves and in the people around us. So that means being aware of changes in behavior, things like increasing isolation, expressing extreme views, or, glorifying violence.
Those are some pretty clear red flags. But how do you approach someone showing those signs? It feels tricky, like I wouldn't want to make it worse.
You're right, it's not always easy. But the key is open communication. Approach them with empathy, concern, express your worries without judgment, and encourage them to get help if they need it. Sometimes just feeling heard and understood can be huge.
That's really good advice. And it speaks to building a culture of compassion, understanding both on and offline. We need to challenge hateful speech when we see it, promote tolerance and empathy, create spaces where people feel safe to be vulnerable without being judged.
Exactly. And beyond individual actions, we need systemic changes too. We have to address what's causing this extremism, things like social isolation, inequality, discrimination. And that means investing in mental health services, building more inclusive communities, promoting education that teaches critical thinking and media literacy.
It's a big job, but it feels vital if we want a world where everyone feels valued, respected, connected. What about social media companies? What role do they play in all of this?
Social media platforms have a responsibility to take action against this extremist content. They need better strategies for finding and removing hate speech, promoting positive alternatives, and they need to work with experts to address the root causes of online radicalization.
It sounds like it takes a multi-pronged approach. Individuals, communities, institutions, all working together to make the digital landscape safer and more inclusive.
Precisely, a collective effort. And it's not just about censorship, silencing different opinions. It's about building a healthy online space where respectful dialogue can thrive and we can challenge those extremist ideologies effectively.
So what would you say to someone feeling overwhelmed by all of this? Someone who feels powerless to make a difference?
I'd say every action, big or small, can create ripples. Start by talking openly with friends and family about these issues. Challenge hate speech when you see it. Support organizations fighting extremism and promoting tolerance. Learn about the warning signs of radicalization and the resources out there for help. Remember, even one voice can make a difference.
That's powerful. And it goes to the heart of this deep dive, I think. Understanding how complex online extremism is, confronting its dangers, and empowering ourselves to act.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that we all have a part to play in shaping a better future, both online and off. It's ongoing, this process. Requires vigilance, commitment.
It's been intense, this conversation, thought-provoking.
Yeah.
I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We've looked into some dark corners of the internet, but I hope we've also shed light on the power of hope, resilience, and working together.
Thank you for having me. And to our listeners, remember, stay informed, stay engaged, and never underestimate the power of your voice to make a positive impact.